All right, most of you are familiar faces, most of you know me, but if you do not, my name is Jeremy Dowsett. I am director of OCIA at Immaculate Heart of Mary Parish. I'm also involved in the parish school there. My title is Dean of Formation. And I'm also completing a PhD in Catholic social teaching. So those are the credentials. Those are why you would listen to me talk for an hour. This is the third in a series of lectures on Catholic social teaching that is sponsored by the Diocese of Lansing, and I was going to say hosted by IHM, but we're obviously not at IHM, so put on by IHM Parish, and this is number 3 of 10. So there will be 2 more of these lectures this semester, and they will be November 12th and November 19th. We tried to have as consistent a pattern as possible, which was going for first and third Tuesdays, I think. However, that landed us right on election night. So we are not, our next one would have been on election night. We're not going to do that. We're going to push that out to the following week, which is November 12th. So we'll meet again on November 12th, and then on the 19th, and then we'll have a break during the holidays and come back in January. Okay, so in the last lecture, I tried to stress the point that the work of building a just and humane society is a part of the mission of the Church. And I tried to do that. I framed things with the question, what is the relationship between salvation and social action, or working to build a better society? And my wife said that was confusing and I didn't do a very good job. And she's usually a pretty good gauge. So before I move on to tonight's subject, which is the principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and the common good, I'm going to try and take just a couple minutes to clarify what I was trying to get at last time by framing this question, what's the relationship between salvation and social action? So hopefully you will be patient with me as I try and clean up my mess from last time. So the point I was trying to make was this. There is a version of Christianity which views salvation in a very individualistic way, in very otherworldly terms. So in this view, salvation means getting into heaven when you die. And in that view, the mission of the Church is evangelization in the very narrow sense of spreading to other people the message, you can get into heaven when you die too. Now, I'm not knocking evangelization in the sense of verbal proclamation of sharing the message about Jesus. We need more of that, not less of that in the Church. But in this version of Christianity, any kind of political action, any effort to transform society or to make it more just and humane are seen as sort of secondary or accidental at best, right? So if in my pursuit of being a virtuous person or in my pursuit of being a holy person, I happen to kind of impact the world for good, it's just sort of a knock-on effect, right? On the other hand, there's a version of Christianity which says that the Church's mission is to save the world in the sense of eliminating poverty and injustice and war in this life. In this version of Christianity, participating in the Church's mission means protesting wars and putting up, climate action now signs in your yard, or in a much kind of tamer version, practicing random acts of kindness and volunteering at the library. So these folks tend to reduce Christianity to nothing more than a social program or a political program. So what I was trying to convey last week, and hopefully I'm doing better now, is that both of these versions of Christianity are wrong, and the reason is not just that they're too extreme, and we need to somehow like strike a balance between the two of them. The reason that they're both wrong is because they both misunderstand what salvation is. They both misunderstand what the mission of the church is, what it was that God was redeeming through the death and resurrection of Christ. And therefore, they misunderstand what our mission is as members of the church. So the first version is wrong because when God sent his Son on this mission of redemption, it was not just to redeem our souls or the spiritual part of us. God's mission was to redeem whole people, and not just people, but a people. And not just a people, but an entire cosmos, his entire creation. Which is why we say, I believe in the resurrection of the body and the life of the world to come every time we go to Mass, when we recite our most fundamental beliefs in the Creed. Paul says it this way in Romans chapter 8. The creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. In other words, the whole non-human created order is waiting for your resurrection, because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will share in the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. That is what salvation is. That is the mission that the church is invited to participate in, the redemption of everything. So we cannot reduce Christianity to something that is just spiritual, something that is completely apolitical and detached from worldly things. We work for the transformation of society because it is a part of the mission of the church. It is an integral part of what it means to bring salvation to the world. The second version that reduces the mission of the church to merely the social and political is wrong because it forgets the transcendent dimension of the human person. The fact that we are people with souls, not just bodies with material needs. And it forgets that the wound of sin needs a transcendent God to heal it. So it forgets that even if we were to succeed in creating a perfectly just society in the sense of perfectly just laws, just market regulation, just institutions, we could not obtain a just society without converting the hearts and minds of individual people. Sinners would still make an unjust society out of a perfectly just set of social structures. To go back to Paul in Romans 8, this version of Christianity forgets that the created order is still groaning, still waiting for God for the redemption of humans. So, again, the point I was trying to make last week, these lectures will go a lot quicker if I don't have to give them all twice, right? The point I was trying to make last week was that the view we should have as Catholics, the view that we're taught by Scripture and by the Church, is that the material and the spiritual cannot be separated from one another. And therefore, the mission of the Church is, in the words of Pope Benedict XVI, to work simultaneously for the conversion of hearts and the improvement of the structures of society. Both are integral parts of the holistic salvation the Church is called to take to the world. So, to give a concrete example of what this looks like, I will use my sister. sister-in-law, Caitlin, whom I did not ask for permission to use as an example because the answer would have been no. Caitlin is a reading specialist who teaches people with learning disabilities how to read and teaches teachers how to teach people with learning disabilities how to read. And she is now in the process of starting at her own school or institute to teach more teachers how to do this. Caitlin works in schools and in prisons with the least and the most struggling among us. She is also one of the one of the most ready evangelists that I know. If you don't have a Catholic medal or a rosary, she will give you one in line at Panera or at the bus stop or at the dentist office or wherever you are. These two sides of her vocation are all very integrated in her work. She's not here tonight, which is good because she would probably be embarrassed that I'm using her. She does not teach people to read just so that she can have a chance to tell them about Jesus. She teaches them to read to improve their lives because reading is vital for education and employment. And because people who can read the Bible and can read about saints and can be evangelized. In other words, her work serves the whole person, body and soul, because as a Catholic, she cares about the whole person. Her work is aimed at the transformation of society by changing how prisons treat the prisoners, how schools teach students, and by building a new little society, her own institute or school. The point is, her work teaching reading is not just an instrument she can use to evangelize or an accidental after effect of the fact that she is pursuing her own holiness or virtue. It is an integral aspect of her evangelism, an integral part of how she is participating in the mission of the church to bring salvation to the world. And the proclamation, the actual talking about Jesus, is just kind of shot through everything that she does. Okay, so hopefully that was clearer than last time. On to tonight's lesson. All right, so if you have the little pyramid chart, we've been working our way up from the bottom, essentially. So we talked about philosophy and the gospel the first night, and then we talked about personalism last time. So now we're going to talk about the next tier in the pyramid, the common good, solidarity, and subsidiarity. So first we should recall what a principle is and what it is for. A principle is a fundamental truth. So these principles of Catholic social teaching are the things that the Church is proposing as true of people and how we relate to one another, universally and permanently, true across all cultures and all times. So there are some aspects of Catholic social teaching that are historically contingent. So for example, our bishops in the US issued a pastoral letter about racism in 1958, and another one in 1979, and another one in 2018. Each of these letters does not say the exact same thing, because the laws and customs and culture of the US changed significantly over that time. So there is growth and development in the Church's social teaching as it addresses new situations as history progresses, as time passes. But the principles of the Church's social teaching are those things which do not change. They are like the laws of physics for human societies. So in this example that I'm using of racism, all three of these pastoral letters about racism affirm the dignity and equality of every human being. The principle of personalism did not change from 1958 to 1979 to 2018, and it will not change in 2055, right? Okay, so what are the principles for? They are criteria for making moral judgments about what we should and should not do, both in terms of our individual behavior and in terms of how all the societies we belong to are structured, the policies, laws, customs, and norms that define how people relate to each other within a society. So these principles guide our consciences, not just in terms of our personal behavior, but in terms of how the societies we belong to ought to be ordered. For example, the principle of personalism, that every human being has dignity and that all human beings are equal, leads my conscience not just to the conclusion that I ought not perform an abortion, but it also leads my conscience to the conclusion that I have a responsibility, with whatever power and influence I have, to work toward a society in which no one performs an abortion. Okay, so our first principle we're going to tackle is the common good. I briefly introduced this concept of the common good in my first lecture with a lot of talk about a soccer team. Hopefully that landed for you guys. It is a fairly counterintuitive idea for our thoroughly individualistic culture. We are so formed by our consumer economy and our technology and our competitive education system that the view that the goods we want are things that we obtain and pursue as an individual is just deeply baked into us. When in fact, most of the goods that matter in life are goods that can only be obtained in common with others. So probably the easiest way to get at the idea of the common good is to think of it as the reason that a society exists in the first place. Okay, so setting aside for a moment the three necessary societies, the ones that are not formed by human choice, which are the family, the nation, and the church. When a group of people gets together and says, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had X? Let's work together and make X happen. X is the reason that society exists. X is also the common good of that particular society. There is a reason that they had to form a society to work together toward X, because X could not be obtained alone by any individual. So if you, for example, form a book club, whether you can articulate it or not, the reason is because you realize that reading a book alone is not the same as reading it and discussing it with other people. The discussion and the debate provides you with a deeper understanding of the book, a richer experience, you learn more. And that richer experience is the reason your book club exists. It is also the common good that you are pursuing together. You cannot obtain that good on your own. You need the group to do it. It is a good you can only have in common. If, for example, one person dominates the conversation at one of your meetings and does all of the talking, everybody in the group misses out on the good, including her. So all societies at every scale can be viewed through the lens of the common good they exist to pursue. A marriage exists for the common good of the bond between the husband and the wife, and the common good of family life, having and raising children. A school exists for the common good of educating and socializing students, of producing skilled, responsible, and virtuous adults. A labor union exists for the common good of safe working conditions and fair wages for employees. When we get to the level of the political community, the city, the state, the nation, the common good becomes a bit more complex. because it is not just one thing we are seeking together in those political societies that we belong to. It is a constellation of all the things that allow smaller societies, the soccer teams, the book clubs, the schools, the families, to reach their fulfillment. So, peace, as in the absence of war, drinkable water, low crime rates, a just legal system, safe roads, free speech, basic health care, access to education, all these things together comprise the common good of a state or a nation. Now, before any of us start worrying about the nanny state, the church teaches that there are legitimate questions about what level of government should be involved in providing these different aspects of the common good to a society, and how they should relate to each other. And we're going to get to that in a second when we talk about our second principle, which is subsidiarity. But the church also teaches that the government's responsibilities to provide for the common good should not include responsibilities that ought to fall to smaller societies, to churches and schools and charities, or to individual citizens themselves. But the libertarian view that the only purpose of government is to defend us from foreign invaders and protect our private property, not compatible with Catholic social teaching, which says that the government exists to facilitate the pursuit of the common good in this more robust sense of all these things that we need to have a just and flourishing society. Okay, so one thing that can often be confusing when reading Catholic social teaching or just listening to people talk about the common good is that the term common good is actually used in two ways. So the common good sometimes refers to the common good of a smaller society, a society that falls somewhere on the scale between the family and the nation, which is what we just walked through. The common good can also refer to the common good, like capital C, capital G, as in the common good of all humanity. Trying to conceive of the common good that is shared by the entire human family can start to feel a bit abstract and unwieldy. But it is something that church teaching affirms. And in an increasingly globalized world, it is ever more apparent that it is a real thing. So consider, for example, the COVID pandemic. Turns out that with international shipping and travel, we all share one biome. And a virus that starts in China will spread to the entire globe. Environmental concerns can also help us see there is such a thing as the common good of all humanity. If we overfish the ocean, right, this will be bad for everyone, not just for people in the fishing industry. All right, now the fact that every society at every scale has its own common good, and then there is the common good of all humanity, raises the question of what we do when the common good of a smaller society, a particular nation, say, seems to conflict with the common good of the whole human family, the common good. So Catholic social teaching would say that the authentic common good of a smaller society will never be at odds with the common good of humanity. If Sweden, to pick a particularly uncontroversial country probably, if Sweden were to overfish the oceans in a way that had a catastrophic effect on the global fishing supply, this wouldn't actually be in Sweden's best interest in the long run either. So they would not be pursuing their authentic common good. So what this means for national governments is that, on the one hand, they cannot forget that the reason they exist is for the common good of the people of that nation, in the same way that your book club exists for the common good of the people in your book club, and not the book club that meets down the block. On the other hand, governments cannot forget, and I'm quoting the compendium here, the contribution that every nation is required in duty to make towards a true worldwide cooperation for the common good of the whole human family and for future generations also. So I think that this relationship between the common good of a people and the common good of all people can shed some light on the current political foment in our own country right now between the MAGA movement, or the America First movement, as Vivek Ramaswamy is calling it, and the very anxious response to it that it is somehow racist or that it is America's version of Nazism. I think that the most charitable read of both sides is that they are each upholding one of these meanings of the common good. So the America First folks are saying, hey, a government exists to serve the common good of its own people, not to facilitate trade for multinational corporations or to encourage offshoring of all our manufacturing and our manufacturing jobs, or to fight wars on the other side of the globe. And those folks who are concerned with the America First movement are saying, as a nation, we have a responsibility to contribute to the common good of humanity and not to seek our own good at the expense of others. And too much emphasis on our national identity or national pride can blind us to that. The church says both these things are true, and if they are authentically pursued, they will not conflict with one another. And I think that is the best answer that I can give to the gentleman who's not here tonight, who asked me the question about nationalism last time. Okay, a couple more things about the common good before we move on. It is important to note that when thinking about and working for the common good, we cannot reduce it to the merely economic or material. Again, the human person is a spiritual being made for a relationship with God. And so, if the common good of a society is the sum total of the conditions which allow people in it to reach their fulfillment, we cannot flatten that to simply mean something like socioeconomic well-being. The GDP cannot measure, right, the common good. The sum total must include the conditions for the spiritual well-being of its members as well, which is why, after the right to life itself, the right to religious freedom is the most fundamental of rights. And also why a government which pretends to be neutral about all moral and religious questions is not seeking the authentic common good of the society that it governs. So let me illustrate this last point by scaling it all the way down to the smallest society, a marriage. If the common good of a marriage is the relational bond between the spouses and the procreation and raising of children, then it's fairly easy to see that the sum total of conditions which allows the members of the family to reach their fulfillment entails certain socioeconomic conditions, right? Someone has to put food on the table. Someone has to provide a roof over their heads. Someone has to change diapers. Children have to be watched. But as my wife is fond of reminding me, the first job of a husband or a wife is to help their spouse grow closer to God, to grow in virtue, to grow in holiness. A husband who provides for all of the material needs of his wife and kids, takes his wife on a date every Friday, makes sure his kids get a great education, attends to their mental and emotional well-being, but is indifferent to their spiritual needs and their spiritual growth, is not pursuing the authentic common good of his family. In the same way, a government that ignores the moral and spiritual elements of what the members of a society need to reach their fulfillment is not doing its most important job. Okay, one last note about the common good before I move on to subsidiarity. The common good is not the same thing as the greater good or the greatest good. I think sometimes people say the greater good when they mean the common good because, again, these ideas are names for things that exist in reality. And so I think we kind of intuit that we're there, even if we have not been taught about them or if we can't articulate them perfectly. But the greater good is actually a concept that comes from collectivism, right? The greater good is sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Am I saying that backwards? Sometimes to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. That's what it is. It's the idea that you might have to trample on the rights of a few people in order to obtain a greater good for the whole society. That is not what the common good means. And the greatest good is a concept from utilitarianism. It is essentially an attempt to mathematically calculate the most moral option by saying whatever brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number of individuals is the right thing to do. This gets us into scenarios where we say it's okay to drown one baby or waterboard one suspected terrorist in order to save a city full of people. This way of thinking violates the principle of personalism. And the compendium explicitly says the common good does not consist in the simple sum of the particular goods of each individual in a society. That might be a little abstract, but hopefully it makes sense. Okay, subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a mouthful, but it is not counterintuitive. It is a bit complex until you wrap your head around it, but once you kind of grasp it, I think it's very intuitive. So we've been talking all along about how we all belong to many different societies at many different scales, from the family to the nation. The fact that all these different societies exist within one big national society means that these societies interact with each other all the time. So subsidiarity is a principle about how societies of different scales ought to relate to each other. Subsidiarity says that a larger scale or higher order society exists to help smaller scale or lower order societies, but they should never absorb or replace them by taking over what those lower order societies can accomplish without help. I know, that's a mouthful. I'll say it again. I'm telling you, once you get it, it's not difficult to understand. Subsidiarity says that larger scale or higher order societies exist to help smaller scale or lower order societies, but they should never absorb or replace them by taking over what those lower order societies can accomplish for themselves without help. So one of the ways I try to get at what subsidiarity means with college students is to point out that the word subsidiarity has the word subsidy in it. To subsidize something is to support it financially just to the threshold of what is needed, right? To make up the difference between what someone has and what they need to make it there, and not to help them any more than that. So subsidiarity says it's wrong for a higher order society to not help a lower order society, but it's also wrong to not intervene where there is a need that they could provide for that society cannot provide for itself. Another way of saying this is that a need or a social problem should be addressed by the smallest scale or most local community possible that has the resources available to meet that need. And each larger scale society should only help to the extent that it cannot. So I like to use the analogy of a ladder. all right? So imagine I'm in my kitchen and I have a 6-foot step ladder. And I have a problem that I'm trying to solve with that ladder. Let's say I need to screw in a light bulb in my kitchen ceiling. If I take 2 steps up the ladder and stop, and I cannot reach the ceiling, I can't solve my problem. It's clear that I'm doing it wrong. I'm not using the ladder correctly, right? Conversely, if I climb all the way to the top step of the ladder and I bang my head on the ceiling, I might be able to screw in the light bulb and solve my problem, but I also will injure myself and possibly fall off the ladder. It's clear that I'm still doing it wrong. I'm not using the ladder correctly. Okay, so now imagine each step on the ladder represents a society to which I belong, in ascending order of their scale, with the smallest one at the bottom. So the first step on the ladder is my immediate family, my wife and kids. The next step on the ladder is my extended family. The next step, at least in a functioning society, would be my neighborhood, but we don't really have neighborhoods anymore. We just have a lot of people who watch Netflix at night in the same basic area. The next step up the ladder might be my local parish. The next step would be civic and professional and charitable organizations that I belong to. A union, the Rotary Club, the Knights of Columbus. Then there would be the municipality, the city or the county that I belong to, then the state that I belong to, and then finally the nation that I'm a part of, right? All right, so we've got our ladder, we know what our steps represent. Now imagine we have a problem that we're trying to solve. I like to use the analogy of education because it kind of lands for everybody. Everybody's gone to school. So let's say I have an 8th grader about to enter high school. Can an 8th grader, as an individual, solve the problem of his education by himself? Can he provide for his own education? No, you're supposed to say no. No, he cannot, right? So it is appropriate that my 8th grader would come to his parents and expect them to help him provide an education for him, right? So subsidiarity says the smallest scale society possible should meet the need first, right? So my 8th grader comes to me first. We're the first society, the first step on the ladder. Now let's say we want to provide our 8th grade kid with a Catholic education, but I cannot afford tuition at the Catholic high school. So now we need to go up the ladder, another step to solve our problem. Step 1 didn't quite get us there, right? But subsidiarity says I don't now jump to the top of the ladder to solve my problem and expect, the nation, the federal government is going to solve my problem and fund my child's education for me, right? I go to the next step first. I go to my extended family. So let's say Grandma and Grandpa and Uncle Earl all chip in and we still don't have the full amount that we need to pay for tuition for our rising freshmen. We go to the next step, right? We would go to our parish, right? Most parishes have like a parish subsidy for Catholic tuition. Then we would go to the high school itself, which would have a scholarship of some kind, which essentially represents going to the diocese as a whole, right? And then let's say we still couldn't afford tuition at the Catholic high school. Now we might at that point choose to go to the public school system, at which point we would be stepping up the last rungs of the ladder that represent our state government and our federal government. Does that make sense? Okay. So one way to think about subsidiarity is that it acknowledges that all societies face problems that are too big for them and need to rely on larger societies for help. And that's why those larger societies exist. But it pushes toward the decentralization of power through the decentralization of responsibility. So the principle of subsidiarity can be violated in both directions. It's a violation of subsidiarity for a larger society to overstep, to fulfill some role or duty that properly belongs to the smaller society. So for example, if the government were to require all preschoolers must attend mandatory preschool, and they must attend the state-run school, there are no other options, they wouldn't be helping, right? They would be usurping the rights of parents. They would be overstepping. This would be a violation of subsidiarity. This kind of intervention deprives people and local communities of their dignity by depriving them of the responsibility to solve their own problems. And it leads to, quoting Pope John Paul II here, an inordinate increase in public agencies and an enormous increase in spending. However, fiscal conservatives out there should know this is not about making space for the market to solve our problems. Believers in laissez-faire capitalism, which again is part of what the church condemns when the church condemns liberalism. When the church says liberalism is bad, totally free market capitalism is part of what it's talking about. Believers in sort of market fundamentalism are quick to criticize big government only to clear space for big corporations to come and solve our problems. But from my personal experience, I would say waiting in line at the Secretary of State and navigating Xfinity's automated phone menu to try to get my internet working are equally dehumanizing experiences that I would prefer not to have. Subsidiarity is not about clearing ground for corporations to solve our problems. It's about the not-for-profit societies, smaller societies addressing local problems, charities, churches, civic organizations, non-governmental NGOs, as we call them. And one of the takeaways of subsidiarity for us at this moment in our history really is that that layer of our civic society has very much eroded, right? Those organizations are disappearing. We don't belong to them anymore because again, we just go home and watch Netflix at night and we don't make time for those things. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of the book Bowling Alone, but that's what that book is about. There's a documentary version of that book that's out right now. If you're interested, I have no idea if it's good. I haven't seen it. I'm not recommending it necessarily, but there you go. Okay, so subsidiarity can also be violated in the other direction though, right? It's also a violation of subsidiarity when a higher level society does not intervene and help or provide resources when it is the only society with enough resources to protect the common good or to serve the common good. So that means that there are times when it is necessary for the state to step in and perform functions that normally belong to smaller, lower order societies. A rather dramatic example of this from our history is the integration of Little Rock Central High School in 1957. So most of us are familiar with the photos of the National Guard escorting the Little Rock Nine into the high school through crowds of protesting segregationists. What some people don't know is that the National Guard is actually a state militia. And the Arkansas National Guard was originally brought in by the governor of Arkansas to stop the black students from entering the school. President Eisenhower had to invoke, I forget what it's called now, the Insurrection Act, I think, to federalize the Arkansas National Guard and take command of them from the governor and reverse their orders so that they then were on the side of the integrationists. This this action of the federal government was not a violation of subsidiarity because the lower order societies involved, the black community in Little Rock, the Little Rock School District, the state of Arkansas. They needed the resources that only the federal government could provide, and the president's actions were taken to pursue the authentic common good of the people of Little Rock and of our nation as a whole. So if you are a politics nerd, you can probably sense how the best impulses of each of our parties in our two-party system emphasize one side of subsidiarity, right? Conservatives are right that we should not look immediately to the government, especially to the federal government, to solve our problems, to solve problems that individuals and families and schools and local communities can solve themselves. In fact, Catholic social teaching says it is a grave evil when that happens. And progressives are right that there is a role for government at each level, including the federal government, to play in how we as political communities provide a social safety net for those who are unfortunate or those who cannot care for themselves. When a society fails to provide for its poor and needy, that is also a grave evil according to the Church's teaching. All right, the last one is the shortest one. Solidarity. The principle of solidarity is not complex, and it is also not counterintuitive. It's quite simple. But it is difficult to live out. Solidarity simply names the reality that all of humanity is connected by virtue of their humanity, both in the very broad spiritual sense that we are all human, and in the sense that we are interdependent. We need each other. Because there are so many goods which we can only obtain in common with others, we are tied to others in each of the societies that we belong to in complex ways. And those societies are tied to each other in complex ways. This means our growth and development as human beings is tied up with the growth and development of others. Solidarity is Martin Luther King Jr.'s recognition in his letter from a Birmingham jail that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice. An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Because, still quoting MLK, because we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. End quote. Solidarity is what Jesus taught in the parable of the Good Samaritan, that the last person in the world you think of as your neighbor is still in some sense your neighbor. It is simply an awareness of our interconnectedness and our shared destiny, and it should lead for love of self and for love of neighbor to, quoting John Paul II again, to a firm and persevering commitment to the common good. This commitment, Pope John Paul said, he called that solidarity as a virtue, solidarity as like a moral virtue that an individual can have, which he said is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of others, but a commitment, again, to genuinely work toward the common good. To have this virtue of solidarity that JP2 talks about, we need two other virtues. The first is gratitude. We need to cultivate our awareness that we are each a debtor to the society that we belong to. Everything that you were born into, a culture, a language, buildings, art, roads and infrastructure, an economy, medicine, science, all of the conditions that our ancestors have bequeathed to us to make life livable and to give us a starting point from which to build a better society. I can remember a moment in my own life when I'm bad at this virtue of gratitude and of recognizing the beautiful thing that I just said in this paragraph, but I can remember a time in my life when this really hit home for me. I had the chance to visit Israel and Palestine about 15 years ago. And one of the places that we visited was a family farm. It was a vineyard. And it was a vineyard that was farmed on a mountainside. And we got there, and I can just remember looking out on this mountainside and realizing that the whole mountainside was terraced, right? So that it could be farmed, so that it could be a vineyard. And I remember looking out like as far as the eye could see at these terraces and realizing they were all held up by stone walls that had been built by hand. Just like an entire mountain became a vineyard because, I mean, literally it was tens and thousands of hours of human work, right? Generations of people had built these stone walls that allowed this place to be a vineyard, and the current generation that was there was living off of the fruit of that, right? We're all in that position, right? We all live on the terraces that are held up by the stone walls that were built by our ancestors. We call it civilization. The second virtue that living solidarity as a virtue requires is justice. Recognizing that as grateful as we are for that inheritance, it is not perfect. And all of the institutions and structures that order our societies are shot through with sin. Because we as humans are shot through with sin. And our ancestors were shot through with sin. The compendium says it like this: on the basis of the principle of solidarity, the structures of sin that dominate our institutions must be overcome. They must be purified and transformed into structures of solidarity through the creation or modification of laws, market regulations, and juridical systems. There are always places where the stones are falling and the walls need to be rebuilt, or places where the walls were not built right in the first place and they are hurting people and they need to be set right. Solidarity is the principle that calls us to do that difficult work. Thank you. All right, perfect timing. I have 1 minute for questions. Does anyone have a question?